On this episode of the OnePeterFive podcast,
a pastoral guideline issued for an individual diocese or region such as Argentina would not normally apply to the whole church. In the Catholic Church, the presumption is definitely in favor of tradition.
He's saying that what we have here on the table is, at least in some sense, it's like a turducken, a turkey inside of a duck inside of a chicken or something. At some point you hit the doctrinal issue, and it's really a doctrine of morals, frankly, I think. But at some point you hit the doctrinal issue, and it's really in Amoris Laetitia, chapter 8. And then that's being taught merely authentically. In other words, non-definitive moral teaching that leads to a pastoral suggestion.
Dr. John Joy and Dr. Michael Sirilla talk with me about the entry of the Pope's Buenos Aires letter into the Acta Apostolicae Sedis, coming up next.
You're listening to the OnePeterFive podcast.
It is a real joy for us to welcome you all here. Habemus Papam.
Rebuilding Catholic culture, restoring Catholic tradition.
Hello and welcome to the OnePeterFive podcast, episode 44. I'm Steve Skojak and I am your host, and today we're going to talk about the Pope's letter to the bishops of the Buenos Aires region of Argentina pertaining to their guidelines on the Apostolic Exhortation Amoris Laetitia, in which they suggested that there should be a path to communion for those divorced and remarried Catholics who, for reasons of complex circumstances, find it not feasible to live in continence with one another. There's a lot of euphemisms and buzzwords there, but basically what we're talking about here is the Buenos Aires bishops drafted these guidelines, the sixth of which, I always have a hard time saying sixth, the sixth of which indicated, following a discussion about how continence should be suggested to those who are divorced and remarried as the proper path, but that there are some in circumstances too complex, whatever that means, it's never defined, for whom continence abstaining, that's the word I'm looking for, abstaining from the marital act between persons who are not married in the eyes of the church is too hard. It's too hard for them. It's not feasible. So they should be given a path to receive absolution and communion anyway. Obviously, this is a very contentious issue, and the Pope, unfortunately, wrote to the bishops of the Buenos Aires region in September of 2016, and he told them that their guidelines were very good. In fact, he said that they had interpreted Chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia correctly, and in fact went so far as to say there were no other interpretations. So that confirmation, of course, of those guidelines was considered by many theologians to be nothing more than papal correspondence, personal correspondence. It was his private opinion because it wasn't something that was promulgated universally for the whole church. He was just affirming them in a private letter that, at least on first appearances, looked like it had been leaked to the press. Although the Vatican was quick to confirm that he did write the letter, and then time passed, and next thing we knew, in August of this year, the letter went up on the Vatican website. And that raised some eyebrows, and people were concerned, and they were like, well, does that make it official? But it was still just listed under the Pope's correspondence, and it was sort of a historical documentary piece of evidence, or so it appeared. I know that I speculated, as did others, when that happened, though, that it would only be a matter of time before that letter would be entered into the Acta Apostolicae, or Apostolicae, I believe, as the Latinists pronounce it. I'm not one. Sedis, which is the official acts of the Holy See, which is a digest that comes out regularly of all the things that the Holy See is doing that are official actions. And it lends an authoritative component to those things that appear in there. In fact, Cardinal Coco Palmerio, who is the president of the Pontifical Council for Legislative Texts, somebody who is in a position who should know what he's talking about when it comes to the weight and authority of pontifical texts. He said that by the Pope entering this letter into the Acta, that it made it part of his authentic magisterium, that and the guidelines that it responded to along with it. So that definitely troubled a lot of people who were already concerned about this letter that appears to give permission for sacraments that should not be received by those who are in an objective state of adultery and have not committed to a change of life, do not have a firm purpose of amendment, and therefore are ineligible to receive absolution or the Holy Eucharist. It's a problem. It's a problem that this permission was given to these people, that the Pope affirmed it, and now we're being told, well, this is magisterial, and if you don't accept it, then you're a dissenter, and, he's the Pope, and you have to do what he says. So what I wanted to do today is, we've addressed this somewhat on the website in our articles, but I kind of wanted to have a conversation about this. So to that end, I've asked a couple of theologians to come on the program to talk about this with me, because I think that a conversation might hash out some of the nuances a little better than writing does. But we're definitely in a difficult situation. We're in an unprecedented situation, and this particular move has really disturbed people more than a lot of other things have, because it looks as though the Pope is essentially just trying to make his will manifest through a technical process that lends gravitas and authority to it. But the question really is, can you make something that isn't really possibly magisterial just because you say so? Even if you're the Pope, do you have the authority to do that? So we're going to talk about that in just a moment. Hey there, 1P5ers, it's Steve. So it's the end of 2017. Yeah, we survived it, barely. And this is the last chance for you to get in a tax-deductible donation in support of our work before the end of the year, so that you can put it on your deduction for taxes next year. Obviously, we are a donor-supported enterprise. We rely upon you and your financial contributions to keep our work going, because we provide our work for free. We don't charge for it, and we hope that you'll find it valuable enough that you'll, chip in a little bit here and there when you can, so that we can keep going. It's easy to donate. You can just go to OnePeterFive.com/donate. There are options there for recurring giving. That's our preference. If you can do it, just set it and forget it. You can give month after month. But if you can't, one-time donations are good. There really is no donation that is too large or too small. You can donate two ways. You can donate by mail. We have a little form that you fill out and send in so that we can set up a record for you to make sure that we have you settled for tax purposes. Or you can donate online through our simple, easy, secure credit card form. We thank you for listening, we thank you for your support, and we look forward to serving you again in 2018. Joining me today, I have not just one, but two theologians to talk about this topic. First, I have Dr. Michael Sirilla, returning guest. He is the Director of Graduate Theology at Franciscan University of Steubenville. And Dr. John Joy, co-founder and president of the St. Albert the Great Center for Scholastic Studies, who specializes in magisterial teaching. Both men are also OnePeterFive contributors. Thank you guys for coming on and talking to me about this today.
Thanks, Steve.
Happy to be here.
It's good to be back.
So we have this news that I talked about earlier in the podcast about Pope Francis having added this letter that he wrote, I believe it was last September, to the Buenos Aires bishops. And the letter basically confirmed the guidelines that they had written, which allowed for communion to be given to the divorced and remarried in certain circumstances, or at least said that it opened a possibility for communion to be given to the divorced and remarried in certain circumstances where they could not live in continence, could not refrain from engaging in the sexual act, despite the fact that it was objectively adulterous. He wrote to the bishops. He praised their guidelines. He said that there were no other interpretations, that they had basically interpreted chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia correctly. and that there could be no other interpretation. So this letter that was sent, that was originally leaked, it seemed, to the press, and many people even questioned its authenticity when it first came out. Next thing we know, it was going up on the Vatican website, and people were saying, well, that doesn't really make it authoritative. It's still personal correspondence of the Pope. It doesn't rise to the level of magisterium. Well, now this month, in the last week, I think it was actually the end of November, we found out that it was entered into the Acta Apostolicae Sedis in October of 2016, and we're just now finding out about it. So the first question I want to ask, and I'll go to John first, what does it mean? What is the Acta, and what does it mean when we add something to it?
So the Acta Apostolicae Sedis is the publication of the official acts of the Apostolic See of the Vatican. So it's used to promulgate all kinds of different documents falling into different categories. So magisterial teaching, doctrinal teaching is included there. Disciplinary stuff is included there. Even seemingly incidental matters of government of the Vatican and so on can all be included there. So what inclusion in the Acta Apostolicae Sedis means, essentially, is that it is an official act of the Holy See, not a private act of the Pope, but it doesn't tell us by itself what kind of act it is, namely doctrinal, disciplinary, etc.
So just throwing it out there to the floor, I mean, does the fact of adding it to the Acta make it magisterial, as some people are claiming?
Well, yeah, John and I were talking about this earlier. The term magisterial is used in many different ways, and I think most of them are legitimate, but you just have to know how you're using it. In a very broad sense, magisterial is used loosely and imprecisely to mean kind of any official act of the Pope or the Magisterium. But in a strict technical sense, which I think we should use perhaps in this discussion, magisterial signifies an official act of teaching as distinct from disciplining or disciplinary or governmental acts. An act of teaching, in its highest form, the deposit of faith and morals revealed by Christ and the Holy Spirit to the apostles and passed along in unbroken tradition, or including those things that are inextricably bound with and connected to that deposit of faith and morals, right? So in that sense, it doesn't seem to me like the Pope's letter to the bishops is magisterial in that precise and strict sense. In the loose sense, fine. But it's a disciplinary letter. In other words, it's a letter about how we should behave, how one ought to, I mean, I think as John said, or maybe you said, Steve, actually, how you ought to interpret Amoris Laetitia chapter 8, the only way you ought to interpret it, apparently, and then also how the bishops in Argentina ought to act. In other words, they may do what they propose to do in the implementation.
So this is something we've talked about in the past, Mike, and I think that it's a point that maybe can't be made often enough, which is, what kind of protections does the Pope have or the Magisterium have when it comes to promulgating acts of discipline and governance? Is there a protection from making mistakes, from errors when it comes to discipline and governance? I mean, it sounds to me like you're arguing this is a disciplinary measure and that's it.
Yeah, let me just say real quick, and then John, I want to hear what John has to say because I think he may know more about this than I do. This is his bailiwick more than mine. But my understanding is that at the very least, the divine promise of indefectibility of the church, that is, the church will not pass away until the end of the world. Matthew 16. Verse 18, Jesus says, the gates of hell will not prevail. On this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail upon it. So that means that any disciplinary act, even the worst possible disciplinary mistakes, let's say, could not be to the level where they would actually destroy the church, because then the gates of hell would have prevailed. However, I do know that some manualists, in my mind, it seems like an overreach, but some of the folks who wrote theological manuals in the late 19th, early 20th centuries argued that infallibility even extends to disciplinary acts. I think Monsignor Fenton may have argued that, but John, do you know more about that?
Yeah, it's a theological opinion, let's say, that has been held by various scholars in the history of the church, but it's certainly one that kind of thing is not directly covered by the Vatican I definition of infallibility, let's say. So So the church's official teaching on what is covered by infallibility is pretty clearly limited to teaching in matters of faith and morals, doesn't include disciplinary stuff. Now,
Absolutely.
scholars are still free to discuss amongst themselves whether maybe something like that does in fact fall under infallibility, but that's definitely going to be an opinion debated amongst scholars, not an official church teaching that we have to accept.
John, that's a really important point. The church does not teach that infallibility extends to disciplinary matters, and but indefectibility does, in the sense that you can't make such a mistake on the level of discipline, a pope or a council can't, to the point where it destroys the church, right?
Sure, absolutely correct. Yeah, but we don't. The difficult part maybe is that we don't have sort of the clear criteria like we do in the case of infallible teaching to know like exactly which kind of disciplinary action would or wouldn't meet those requirements. So we just have a kind of outer limit guarantee that at least something totally catastrophic couldn't happen.
Right.
Would it be fair to say at this point in the conversation, because this is something that both of you have helped me with over the last year, and as a fairly knowledgeable pew sitter, I think we know, the church has a magisterium, and some things are infallible, and some things are not, and blah 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 blah. But there's a lot of wiggle room left in the understanding of how the magisterium works, what the charism of infallibility includes. Is that fair to say that there's a lot of work for theologians still to carve out what the limits and bounds of this stuff really entails?
Yes.
I might put it a little differently. I think that the materials are, as far as infallibility for teaching in faith and morals, I think everything necessary is there. In other words, the knowledge is available, but it's not readily accessible. In other words, it's not been well disseminated, and in fact, most discussions of it immediately get twisted up in all kinds of ambiguity, especially regarding terminology. Terminology is a huge issue in this topic, because there are lots of sort of technical terms we use, like authentic, magisterium, ordinary, extraordinary, and so on.
And as you've demonstrated, these have evolved over the last 100
years. What people mean by these has changed over time. People mean different things by them when they're talking to each other, so you talk past each other frequently. And the church herself has not given, there's no dictionary of theological terms which the church has promulgated for us. So it's, in my experience, the most people, when they get involved in discussions of these things, are speaking different languages almost. So it's very hard for two people to have a clear conversation about this topic.
Yeah, I'm finding that happens in most of my discussions about these kinds of things. Honestly, I mean, this is a personal theory and a tangent, but every crisis that has afflicted the church throughout its 2,000-year history has resulted in some great clarifying action. And I suspect that when we emerge from the doctrinal crisis and confusion that we find ourselves in, this is exactly where we're going to see a lot of development, is in this area of helping to define these terms in ways so that we can all be on the same page. I hope it's the case. Well, I don't know that it is.
A couple things real quick. First of all, I think, John, you're right. In a certain respect, absolutely. All the basic teaching is clearly given on the kind of extent and limits of infallibility, when it occurs, how it occurs, despite the fact that, as you note, there is a terminology confusion and problem, even with, like you said, same terms, ordinary, extraordinary, definitive, non-definitive, being used in magisterial documents slightly differently from one another. And now I'm going to give a shameless plug for John's new book, which is coming. It's coming out in just a few days. It's called On the Ordinary and Extraordinary Magisterium, from Joseph Kleutgen to the Second Vatican Council. And you can get it on Amazon. I'm looking at it on Amazon right now. But in any event, here's
John, we're going to have to put something out about this.
It's good. It might be difficult for the non-expert, but certainly not impossible, especially for people who read First Things. I mean, I think you can get through a lot of it, but John could speak to that better. But let me add this one point, though, John. John, I do think there's a lot of confusion on whether or not this seems preposterous, I suppose, but whether or not non-infallible teachings can be an error. There's a lot of confusion, even among experts,
Yeah.
even among expert theologians.
is.
There's a lot of confusion on that question. And that's very relevant to this issue of the letter to Argentina and Amoris Laetitia.
There is, and frankly, it baffles me. So I could tell you stories of my licentiate defense and doctoral defense, going back and forth with my examiners about the use of a term non-infallible. Does it mean the same thing as fallible? And from a just sort of logical linguistic perspective, it baffles me how anyone could think that non-infallible doesn't mean fallible. But that seems to be, but that seems to be where we are.
It's preferable to be euphemistic, right?
Right.
Well, I prefer to be blunt, but
well, listen, part of the problem is that third paragraph of the Oath of Fidelity, okay, the profession of faith and the Oath of Fidelity that we all take in theology and priests take. Well,
who all take?
Except for Steve. Okay, yeah. So, without going into too much background, John Paul II promulgated an oath of fidelity and profession of faith that all theologians and priests and people in pastoral ministry are required to take upon assumption of the office that they're given. And some of us receive something called a mandatum from the local bishop, which means a mandate or permission or kind of authority to teach in communion with him and teach the faith, okay? But in any event, this third paragraph talks about how we are to assent to non-definitive teachings of the Magisterium, and the Latin uses...
That's a reference to Lumen Gentium 25, right?
Yes. The religious submission of will and intellect to the authentic magisterium is mostly taken from the language of Lumen Gentium 25.
Now, there's a terminology issue here too, a translation issue, John and Steve, that causes difficulty, right? So the Latin is obsequium religiosus or something like that, religiosum.
Yep.
Obsequium in Latin could definitely mean submission. It could mean obedience. It could also mean respect and reverence. In the Italian, I just found out from a friend who's studying at the Angelicum, who's getting ready to take the oath. He looked at the Italian text of the oath, and they use the Italian word for obsequium, ossequios, or something like that. I forget the exact term, but it doesn't bear the meaning of submission. It bears the meaning of respect and reverence. So there's this issue. These translation nuances show the spectrum of living the way that the live theologians interpret this differently. Some interpret submission to mean you just accept it's true. Boom, that's it. So it's in essence not terribly different from infallible teaching, except it may not be a matter of revealed truth. But on the other end, you have those who see it, and even manualists have seen it this way from the 19th to 20th centuries, that it means a reverential preparedness to accept it as true, but there's some qualifications there. It has to be something taught kind of in conformity to what Christ revealed, the Holy Spirit to the apostles, and the church's teaching, especially prior infallible magisterial teachings.
Yeah, and this is important, and I want to circle back to this, especially because John wrote something for us today that actually talks about this. I actually think that it was kind of the key point in the larger essay. And John, I know you're up against a hard break in about 10 minutes, so I want to be sensitive to your time. Mike, you can stay on as long as you'd like.
Yeah, let John talk. But yes.
If John has to drop off, that's fine too.
Yeah.
I want you to contribute.
No, I want him to talk.
These are big topics. We can easily talk a lot about it. We'll get back to that essay in a minute. But something I want to point out is that my reading, just as a layman who has studied theology to some extent on this letter, then this letter is really the subject. I know we're talking about the larger categories, but this letter to the Buenos Aires bishops is not really even a teaching on faith and morals. It's a pastoral instruction that's related to an interpretation of a reflection on some pastoral considerations on faith and morals. I mean, it seems like it feels far enough removed from the original text of Amoris Laetitia. Then you have these bishops' guidelines. Then you have the Pope writing to them. Then it gets put into the Acta. I mean, these strike me as pastoral teachings. Amoris Laetitia number 3 makes clear that this is not necessarily for the whole church, that different regions are going to apply different solutions, et cetera, et cetera. This isn't a universal teaching as far as I can ascertain. Are pastoral teachings in any way something that can demand the assent of the universal church? Does the bishops in Poland have to concede that, despite the fact that they're saying they're sticking to the traditional disciplinary practice on communion, do they have to concede, well, yes, there are circumstances in which we would have to honor this letter and say that, yes, we could give communion to somebody who's still living in an adulterous union? Does it bind in any way? Does it demand their assent on that level, or is it just pastoral and therefore practical? Does that make
Sure,
sense?
yes. Okay, let me answer that by taking one step backwards and just speaking of that kind of teaching in general. So a pastoral guideline issued for an individual diocese or region, such as Argentina, would not normally apply to the whole church. Now, but Amoris Laetitia does apply to the whole church, right? So the issue here is that the Pope's letter, the content of the Pope's letter is a kind of factual assertion about the correctness of the bishop's letter, and the bishop's letter is again a factual assertion about the intended meaning of Amoris Laetitia. And Amoris Laetitia does apply to the whole church. So it is, but it's several steps removed, as you were saying. So it's a factual statement about a factual statement about a pastoral practice, which has doctrinal implications. So there are doctrinal implications. So there's something there. I don't want to just say it has no doctrinal content, but it has quite minimal and pretty far removed doctrinal content. However, in that kind of situation, where we're talking about, so it does come back around to a document which is addressed to the universal church, and so that does require, in the ordinary case, obedience or religious submission or whatever the right category is for the particular kind of thing we're talking about. The difficulty comes into play with the precise issue of whether it corresponds with prior church teaching. So that's the real issue. So these technicalities about which category it belongs to and whether it pertains to the universal church and so on, those are all important. I don't want to deny that in any way. But I think the core of the issue here is always going to be whether it conforms to prior church teaching and teaching specifically at a higher level. Because whatever obligation we have to a teaching of the magisterium or a disciplinary rule of the governing church, which is issued at a lower level than something which conflicts with it, we're going to be obliged, we're going to have a greater obligation to hold to the teaching which is promulgated with a higher level authority. So I think that's always going to be the core of the issue here. And these other things are, unfortunately, sort of complicating it.
So this brings up a few points, and I don't know if we're going to wind up having time before you have to go. But I mean, you wrote today. I think that this, for me, was the key takeaway from your essay today that we published. You said, so what does the obligation of religious submission mean for Catholics in individual cases of teaching from the authentic magisterium? I think it can be summed up best by saying that we should accept that teaching as true precisely to the extent that it does not conflict with irreformable Catholic doctrine. So that essentially sets up for me a question on magisterium, which is, how does the magisterium work? I have seen people propose that new teachings modify what exists in the perennial teaching of the church in such a way that what came before, the teaching that came before, almost as though it was like the church didn't have enough knowledge back then, and now they're smarter and they know better things, and so we can modify what was taught before, as opposed to the way I've always understood it, which is the perennial teaching of the church is what has precedence. It's almost like stare decisis in the principle of the law. This idea of precedent exists and we build on precedent. We don't overturn precedent for no reason. So what came before has the weight, and any novelty, any innovation, such as it is, or even any development, which development can never be a U-turn, but it's sort of the growing of the tree. We're adding branches, but we're not taking away from the main body. That the new is always evaluated in light of the old, and it can't conflict with the old. If it does, then it's called into question. Is that a fair understanding, that latter portion of how the magisterium works? I mean, which thing do we read in light of what?
Yeah, so this might be a great point for Mike to chime back in, because I know he's working on some of these things right now. But in the Catholic Church, the presumption is definitely in favor of tradition. Tradition is one of the sources of revelation. Tradition is the means by which revelation has come down to us from the apostles. So all other things being equal, the prior teaching would certainly have as much, if not more, authority. But the more important distinctions are that the more authoritative. So a doctrine which is taught with infallibility is going to outweigh a doctrine that is not taught with infallibility. So the non-infallible doctrine has to be read in light of the infallible doctrine. That's a specifically theological principle. But there's also just a common literary principle which applies to any kinds of writings, not just theological, that you have to interpret what is unclear in light of what is clear. There's no way that you can legitimately take something which is ambiguous and use it in order to shed light on something which is more clear. It always goes the other way around.
I couldn't have said it better myself, John. That's exactly right. In fact, it reminds me of an article that we were all talking about earlier off the air by Jessica Murdoch, teaches at Villanova University, a great theologian there. Her article in First Things, Creeping Infallibility, September 2016, last year, where she makes exactly this point, that the infallible teaching is that in the light of which we ought to read the non-infallible, non-definitive teaching, and that the ambiguous needs to be read in light of the clear. Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah, John Henry Newman, let me throw this in as well. John Henry Newman, in his very famous essay on the development of doctrine, which everybody talks about but nobody has read, says that the understanding of the truths of the faith actually diminishes over time, that the apostles themselves had the greatest understanding of all the truths of the faith, and it actually diminishes over time as we get farther away from them. Whereas the presumption today, I think, in our sort of arrogant modern technological culture, we have the assumption that knowledge and understanding must always be growing just because our technological ability is growing.
Yeah, no doubt. Now, somebody...
That's interesting, because, I mean, Pope St. Pius X obviously condemned in his encyclical Pascendi. He talked about how modernists, look at dogma as though it has to evolve, right? That it's constantly evolving. And again, it's that principle of we know more now than we knew back then. We're more enlightened. It has the religious sensibility has to apply to the present time, and yada, yada, yada. And I feel like that's kind of what we're talking about here is we got.
No, it is.
The apostles were so much closer to the source. Go ahead.
Yeah, it is. But now, surprisingly, someone will come up with, and people in fact have, and John's probably heard this before, maybe you have too, Steve, with the claim that the position that John and I and you are espousing here, Steve, is itself falls afoul of a different aspect of modernism, which it doesn't, but the claim is that we do, namely the false principle of immanentism. In other words, making your own inner experience, your own private self, the judgment and criterion, right? So your own private judgment's the criterion of. So the claim would go like this: well, you're saying that the current teaching, if it has to be, if it's non-definitive and if it's in conflicts with prior definitive infallible teaching, you have to go with the infallible teaching. Well, you're saying that as a private judge. Who are you to make that judgment?
Right.
You see?
Exactly.
But that's not so hard to respond to address properly. The fact is, we're not in this hypothetical, we're not responding with our private judgment that the current magisterium is in error in its non-definitive teaching. In a given teaching, let's say it's an error. We're not privately judging that. What we're doing is appealing to a public official judgment of the prior magisteriums, prior magisteria. So it's actually appealing to a public official infallible teaching of the past to qualify or correct or clarify a non-definitive teaching in the present. So that's an important objection to anticipate and to address.
Right. The documents of the magisterium from former ages are public documents. right? So,
Oh, and one thing that's critical is that the current members of the magisterium itself, those members themselves, they have a duty, as do all faithful Catholics, to give the assent of faith, the highest assent possible of theological faith, to prior
that's right.
infallible magisterial teachings. That's
But the
critically
bizarre thing
important,
is
too.
that the opponents that we are facing, that, well, I'm not going to include you guys, but that I'm facing on this issue, are basically acting as though informed Catholics are incapable of reading. You know, that I can't say, well, the infallible teaching said that this is black, and then the new teaching says this is white. There's a conflict. They are treating it as though it's a private judgment. I mean, I had a guy on Twitter say to me just a couple days ago, he said, if the Pope explicitly says something is magisterial and you dissent, you have absolutely no justification for calling yourself an Orthodox Catholic.
Was his name Rex Mottram?
Yes, it was Rex Mottram, the
Yes.
great, from Evelyn Was, the Brideshead Revisited. Yeah, but I mean, it's, this is this concept is, well, the Pope told you that this letter is magisterial, and yet, so you can't dissent or you can't call yourself a Catholic. Meanwhile, I'm sitting here looking at, EWTN, Canon 18 of the Council of Trent says, if anyone says that the commandments of God are, even for one that is justified and constituted in grace, impossible to observe, let him be anathema. And then I flip over to the letter to the Argentinian bishops' guidelines, and they say that in other more complex circumstances, when it's not possible to obtain a declaration of nullity, the aforementioned option of continence may not, in fact, be feasible. So on one hand, we have Trent saying, you can't say that people can't live the calling that God has asked us to live, the virtuous life, the holy life. And then you have these guidelines saying, well, it may not be possible for you to live that life. And I'm being told to accept that that's now the magisterium, or I'm a dissenter and I can't call myself Catholic. And for those of us who are out there having these discussions with people in our parishes or on Facebook or wherever it is that we're encountering it,
Yeah.
It's a maddening situation, because it seems like we just don't have any recourse to anything to say, well, no, I'm pretty sure that this is why this is right. And it's not just, our personal satisfaction or frustration in a debate. This is souls are being led into error and ultimately into sin potentially by this. And it matters to be able to clarify this for people, because it's not coming from on high.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I think there's that's based on a misunderstanding of what it means to be an Orthodox Catholic. So an Orthodox Catholic means one who believes all the teachings of the church. Let's just, with a simple definition there. It doesn't mean one who believes anything that the current Pope happens to say, right? That's papalatry. That's the Protestant caricature of Catholicism.
Yeah,
That's
right.
what Catholics have been trying to explain to Protestants for 500 years, that's not what we're about.
Right, exactly.
And all of a sudden, that's what we're about. No, the church is a bigger thing than the Pope, right? The church is a bigger thing than the Pope. The Pope is the head of the church. We're grateful for the Petrine ministry. But the church teaches and the Pope teaches are not exactly equivalent. When the Pope exercises his gift of infallibility and speaks ex cathedra and gives us a definition, then the Pope teaches and the church teaches are equivalent. When the Pope is exercising his authentic magisterium without infallibility, it's more proper to say the Pope teaches than to say the church teaches. So,
can you reiterate one more time, just briefly, the elevator pitch? What does it mean when someone says authentic magisterium? I mean, this is what Cardinal Coco Palmerio, the president of the Pontifical Council for Legislative Texts, said about this document being entered in the AAS. He says, while the content of the Pope's letter itself does not contain teaching on faith and morals, it does point toward the interpretations of the Argentine bishops and confirms them as authentically reflecting his own mind. Thus, together, the two documents became the Holy Father's authentic magisterium for the whole church. Now, when I read authentic, I'm like, is it really magisterium or is it not? But there's really a different meaning to authentic, isn't there?
well, yeah, and there are different meanings to magisterium even. So authentic means authoritative. Authentic is an unfortunate translation because in English, authentic sounds like it means genuine or something like that.
Yeah,
It just
exactly.
means,
Is it
it means
valid
authoritative.
or is it?
So it means it has some authority. If something is described as authentic magisterium, it means it has some degree of authority. But what degree of authority then has to be specified by a lot of other factors. And then magisterium also, there isn't just one magisterium, if that might sound a little weird, but the magisterium means teaching authority. Magisterium is a concept of having the authority to teach. Now, so the church has a magisterium, the church has authority to teach. The Pope also has a magisterium, he has authority to teach. Individual bishops each have their own magisterium, they have a kind of authority to teach, but the kind of authority that a local bishop has is clearly less than what the Pope has as the head of the universal church, right? And the kind of authority that the Pope has speaking ex cathedra is more than he has when he's not speaking infallibly. So which magisterium are we talking about is an important question as well. Are we talking about the magisterium of the church, or are we talking about the magisterium of the Pope? And again, sometimes those come to the same thing when the Pope speaks infallibly, and sometimes they don't. So we can't just say the magisterium as if there were only one thing and we knew what we were talking about.
That's a good point, John. And to add to that, I think Cardinal Palmerio's phrase, authentic magisterium, if he meant it, and I suspect maybe he did, I don't know, but if he meant it,
he's a guy in a position to know what it means if he's on the Pontifical Council.
Well, you'd think so, but you'd be surprised at how ignorant sometimes theologians and cardinals can be. We all, and myself included. I learn new things every day, but I think he may have been using it the way Lumen Gentium 25 uses it, authentic magisterium, to signify, John, correct me if I've got it wrong, but to signify the Pope teaching in a non-definitive fashion. Sometimes we call it merely authentic magisterium.
Merely universal or merely ordinary?
No, merely authentic. Well, okay. I'm trying to avoid ordinary. Yeah, John will agree with me. John's convinced me. I think ordinary is unhelpful. I think
it is unhelpful. It drives me crazy trying to make these distinctions.
Yeah. So if that's what Palmerio meant, and I think that's a fair way to read his statement, then he's saying that what we have here on the table is, at least in some sense, it's like a turkey inside of a duck inside of a chicken, or something. At some point you hit the doctrinal issue, and it's really a doctrine of morals, frankly, I think. But at some point you hit the doctrinal issue, and it's really in Amoris Laetitia, chapter 8, and then that's being taught merely authentically. In other words, non-definitive moral teaching that leads to a pastoral suggestion. Is that fair? I think that's what he's saying.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think so. The term authentic magisterium in itself just means it has some degree of authority. So you could say that infallible teaching also belongs to the authentic magisterium. As in, authentic magisterium is the genus. Infallible magisterium is a certain species within that genus. But then the rest of the teaching within the same broad genus, which isn't infallible, doesn't have another special name, so it just also gets called authentic magisterium. When we want to be really precise, we say they're merely authentic magisterium.
Merely, yeah.
To mean it. But when somebody says, like in this instance, when somebody describes something as an act of the authentic magisterium, what they're doing is they're claiming that it has some authority, but they are specifically not claiming that it's infallible.
Right.
I'm never going to remember all these distinctions. I have to be honest.
I'm sorry.
Well, that's why you're recording it. And that's why you're going to get John's book for Christmas.
No, but I mean, but this is, but I do think this is what complicates these discussions. Let me ask you this, John, because I know you got to run. And we can actually wrap this up, because I think that this is a heavy enough topic that I don't want to go on too long with this. People need to kind of digest it, and some people may want to listen over again. Is it fair to say that ours is a propositional faith? If you tell me, Steve, you've got to give your assent to this teaching from the Pope, is it my response? Is it fair for me to say back, to which proposition, of the Pope do I have to give my assent? What is it that he said in this letter to the Argentinian bishops that I have to give my assent to? Can it be boiled down that way? So, I mean, the Pope said that contraception is intrinsically evil. Okay, I give my assent to that. The Pope said that the Trinity is three persons who are consubstantial. Okay, I can give my assent to that. Is there a proposition here? I mean, is that something we should be looking for when we're evaluating the authority of these things and the need to give our assent per Lumen Gentium 25, that there's a proposition there to give our assent to?
I'm going to say yes, and then I'm going to leave it to Mike to expand on that because I got to go. Thanks so much for having me on, though.
All right. Thanks for being
All
on,
right.
John.
Take care. God bless.
That was great.
You just totally ditched us on that one.
Well, look, you said you wanted to wrap up on a question that's crazy difficult.
Well, I mean, I don't know if
John
it's
says yes.
difficult. It seems to me simple. I mean, it's like, you know, everything in the creed is a proposition, right? Everything that's dogmatic is a proposition.
No, that's right.
I know the things that I'm.
You're right. It is, and it is simple. Aside from the fact,
otherwise,
that,
I feel like I'm writing a blank check. I'm signing an open-ended contract.
No,
saying,
that's
I
right.
give my assent.
Yeah.
But I don't know to what.
Right. Well, first of all, this is a little bit of a side point, but it's important because some theologians might be listening or theology students. And they'll know that it is very popular and has been very popular for almost 100 years now, since modernism, to say that our faith is not propositional. But it is. You're right, it is. But a lot of folks will say it's not. Propositions, they'll say, in the more radical and heretical way to express it, they'll say that propositions are purely human inventions to express the ineffable mystical experience that we all have of the divine within ourselves. Okay, and that's the real radical heretical way to say it. But others, like the late Cardinal Avery Dulles, who was a fantastic theologian, will also say things that are in a more orthodox key, but still that, like, kind of in its essence, faith itself transcends proposition, expressed in propositions by the church that are binding. But that's a side point. So what are you, John said yes to what question? The question you asked, Steve, is this right? Is that, am I required to assent, is the word I think you used, to assent to the Pope's letter in the Acta?
Yeah,
right?
I mean, because it sounds like what I'm being asked is to give my assent to a document in its entirety that has virtually no specificity to it.
Right. So, well, it does, but here's the thing. I think it does have some specificity, but here's the thing. It's unfair for me to say this because John's gone, but I think the answer is no.
We won't attribute it to him.
I think that, of course, but I wish you were here. I think the answer is no. You're not to assent to it because if assent is used in the strict sense, assent means assent to a teaching, a proposition on faith and morals. And there's no doctrinal teaching in that letter. What the letter is doing is it's a disciplinary letter, as John himself, agreed with in the earlier part of the conversation. And so what's required is not assent, but rather obedience, right? So assent is given to the teachings, obedience is given to the disciplinary and governmental norms, okay? So we're required to obey it. Now, what does obeying it entail is a difficult issue, but I think one of the things, at least, that it entails is that it's saying you have to interpret Amoris Laetitia 8 the way that the Argentinian bishops did. Is that fair? Do you?
Yeah, that's what I believe that it's saying. And if we're going to look at what...
So I'm not saying you dissent. By the way, for the record, I'm not saying you dissent to it. I'm just saying it's not a matter of assent. It's a matter of obedience.
No, but I mean, I think that this is really significant, right? Because we are already, people like me, are being accused of being dissenters.
Right.
And when I distilled down the combination of the Buenos Aires letter with the Pope's letter back to them, I put it into one summary paragraph. These guidelines are saying that the possibility of access to the sacraments of reconciliation in the Eucharist, confession, and communion for those in complex circumstances where limitations would lessen their responsibility and guilt, and they will not make the commitment to live in continence, to refrain from sexual activity, the Pope said, that's okay. In fact, there's no other interpretation. You can give communion to some of those people without ever specifying when and what the conditions were and how we determine that. How do we give our assent? Not only to that because of it being a clearly problematic teaching in terms of prior teaching, but how do you give your assent to something even if it was about something innocuous that's ambiguous and non-specific? How do you give your assent to that?
Do you find that ambiguous? Because it seems to me pretty clear.
It's clear in terms of the principle of there are some circumstances when.
Right.
But it's not clear at all about what those circumstances are and when they would happen and whether there are certain conditions that have to apply.
Yeah. In Amoris Laetitia 8, some of those conditions are specified. I mean, it could have been more detailed, and it's not, but it's not terribly general. Yeah.
But I mean, if we wanted to be sophists about it, right, we could probably come up with a scenario where someone is in a situation
Right.
where, let's say it's a woman in a third world country who's the husband is very much, because it's a patriarchal society, he has authority over her, and he is being abusive, and she needs to engage in relations. And I mean, there are people who come up, this is what people think that Amoris Laetitia was about.
Yeah.
I don't think it was, but if we were to enter into that hypothetical, you could say there are circumstances where someone is in a situation that they can't get out of.
Yeah.
And
Steve,
their guilt is mitigated.
You can say
and they
that,
could continue to receive communion. You could say
that's
what it means.
That's really heartbreaking. That's really heartbreaking. That's heartbreaking.
And I don't think it really is what this is about, and I don't think it's really what's happening, and I don't think that that's even the point.
But do you think even that it would be okay if it's in an extreme case like the one you mentioned? Because even then, there's a problem.
I think that there is a problem.
Because you can go
through. If I were in that situation, I mean, granted, it's hard to abuse a 6'4" man of my girth and mass,
right.
But let's just say I had a wife, who was handy with a rolling pin.
Yeah.
I can't imagine.
Or a ninja wife.
Or ninja wife,
yes,
as some of us might have.
Yes.
I can't imagine being in a circumstance where this was happening, and I would feel okay with presenting myself for communion. I would be going to confession saying, I don't want this to happen. I'm trying to stop it from happening.
Okay, well, that's different.
There would be
that's different, because that wouldn't be an example, because the Argentinian bishops and Amoris Laetitia both say that the Argentinian bishops say they're just unwilling to live in continence, and then Amoris Laetitia says unable without committing further sin
to live in continence.
Yeah.
I want to know where it's not feasible for people to not
live
in continence.
So let me say this. You can take every single moral virtue and all the 4 moral virtues and the 3 theological virtues and all of their many, many, many species. So there's faith, hope, and charity, theological virtues. There's prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance, the moral virtues. And then there's like dozens and dozens of species of each of those virtues, okay? And you can come up with a hypothetical situation, Steve, where it is egregiously difficult and possibly to the point of death, okay? Not just abuse, but death, to obey God's commandment for any of those species of virtue or vice, the contrary vice, okay? From everything from heresy with respect to faith to, hatred with respect to charity to adultery with respect to temperance, okay? So you can get, and the church has consistently taught, and Jesus taught, and the apostles taught, and consistently from that point on, that really there are exceptionless, well, JP2 put it this way in Veritatis Splendor, there are exceptionless moral norms. There are certain moral norms that admit of no exceptions. And yes, that does sometimes mean you have to suffer death, or less than death, just abuse or privation or suffering. Any of us who've converted in our young adult or adult lives very often had to go through very painful social situations where we break off friendships or relationships that aren't appropriate in the Christian Catholic life, that cause great friendships are gone, and there's great pain that lasts the rest of your life. Okay,
so I was spitballing when I was trying to figure out a scenario, but really,
no, I don't think there is. I mean, I think what John or you quoted Trent. You quoted Trent, and Trent says it. I mean, that.
How do you give your assent to this teaching?
So
it's not fair to ask.
Well, for most of us, we won't have to. For most of the lay faithful, we won't have to deal with it. For those who are divorced and remarried, there are a bunch, but that's not the majority of Catholics, but there's a large number of them. They have to engage with this. Theologians who have to teach it, we have to deal with it. And priests and bishops who have to implement it, they have to deal with it.
Well,
so
I have to deal with it because I'm a commentator on things that are going on in the public life of the church. And
so how do we do it? Yeah.
I don't see how I can give my assent to this, but then that throws us into the quandary of, then what exactly does this mean? And I don't know if there's a tidy way to answer that question.
Those who've spoken out very clearly and vigorously about the problems, like Joseph Seifert and others, many of them have suffered some poignant retribution, right, for doing so.
Right.
So we're in a very, I think, frankly, it's a very unhealthy situation in the church right now, where instead of engaging in a relatively dispassionate theological discussion and debate, where we examine carefully and thoughtfully both sides, right? So that we can come to a knowledge of the truth, right? Instead, we have a somewhat of a kind of chilling situation. There's a pall cast over this milieu, right, where it's very it's intimidating for people, especially with authority or teaching authority, right, or teaching position, or priests, to speak about it, because people have been punished, right?
Yeah.
But it would be nice if we could just talk about it without that.
What's interesting is that it
looming.
came up in one of the discussions I had today online. That John the 22nd, Pope John the 22nd, despite the fact that technically he had heretical ideas, it hadn't, the beatific vision and the vision of God and when it would happen and all that hadn't really been defined yet by the church. But technically he held heretical.
But it had been taught. No, it had been taught,
and it was divinely revealed.
Yes.
But I mean, technically he had heretical views, right?
Right. Materially, yeah.
But what he did was he said, well, I consider this a question that's totally open for theological debate.
That's right. And he invited it and asked for it and got it.
He got it, and then he recanted his position and said, I never meant to lead anybody into error. He was open to it. So here we have this pope that, history has essentially viewed as an example of a pope who held heretical views.
Right.
Who is being more open to this dialogue and this natural academic discussion over these theological principles than what we're dealing with now.
Well, yes and no. I mean,
you just have to shut up and accept it. You don't have any choice.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think generally, absolutely, that's right. Okay, in general terms, because he, in writing, in his, these were homilies he gave, and then when he had them published and promulgated throughout the Catholic world, throughout Catholic Europe, we're talking about 14th century. At the end of them, he added the note, but if anyone can show that I'm fallen into error here, I'll correct my position. So he said that from the very beginning, and he invited the discussion. Now, so in general, what you said is exactly right, but there is a few parts of that history that are really painful and rough. For example, some members of the Holy Office of the Inquisition, which is now called the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, nice tamer term, but they did actually persecute and discipline, not physically torture or anything, but just kind of go after and discipline certain theologians who disagreed with John the 22nd's homilies. So there were some casualties even then. Okay, so there were, but I don't think the general feeling was quite as fearful as it is now. Yeah, I think that's right. It's not good, man. Not good.
No, it's not. And I think that, this is probably a good place to leave it. I didn't propose to be able to have a solution to this crisis at the end of 45 minutes. But this is what Catholics are grappling with. This is what theologians are grappling with. This is what pastors are grappling with.
Yeah. Yeah. Listen, could I ask?
It's not sustainable. Please do. Yeah. Go ahead.
You and the listeners to take what I'm about to say without the general ennui and kind of tiredness that usually accompanies what I'm about to say, which is prayer and penance. You hear, oh yeah, prayer and penance, right? All right, I hear that again. But listen, I'm telling you very seriously and urgently that daily prayer, morning offering, evening examination, 15 minutes at least of mental prayer a day with Jesus, preferably before the Blessed Sacrament, frequent reception of the sacraments, and doing the first Fridays, doing the first Saturday devotions, making reparations, little acts of reparation is absolutely critical. We all need to love the Holy Father, and praying for him, the success of his pontificate, and doing prayers of penance and reparation for his sins and the sins of all the bishops, priests, and lay people, all of us. I guess first we have to do reparation for our own sins, but also for the sins of others in the church. John Paul II, we'd hear, right, that he'd go to confession once a week, I think, or very frequently. So popes, they sin and they need our prayers. They're our brothers in Christ as well as our Father in Christ. So I think, and the church is just suffering something really, really immense, Steve. So as trite as it may sound, it's just urgent to incorporate some daily penance, some kind of daily little thing. Just whenever you're in the car, maybe don't listen to the radio or something, right? I don't know. I'm
tempted right now just to add some dramatic piano music.
Nice.
This is very touching appeal. No.
It is.
I have to keep my sense of humor about this thing.
But yeah.
No, I know you're right. It sounds like a lot of work.
You've never done that before. That's awesome. At least not while I've been on. That's awesome.
Oh, I have like a soundboard here, so I can add.
Hey, darling,
dramatic piano music.
Want to go to First Friday Mass with me and do some reparation together?
Would you like that? Small meals equal to one larger meal.
That's great. Oh, yes, I forgot that one. That's really good.
All right. Well, Mike, I appreciate it as always. So we were speaking today again with Dr. Michael Sirilla, Director of the Graduate Theology at Franciscan University, and Dr. John Joy, who is the co-founder and president of the St. Albert the Great Center for Scholastic Studies. He had to drop off early because he had another engagement. But thank you both for being on.
Thanks so much, Steve. God bless you, buddy.
All right. Thank you. You've been listening to the OnePeterFive podcast. This has been a production of OnePeterFive Incorporated. Copyright 2017, all rights reserved. Please remember to visit us online at OnePeterFive.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider making a tax-deductible contribution to support our work at OnePeterFive.com/donate. Thank you for listening.